Today, we are making history because we have our first ever man on the podcast. How does it feel to break that glass ceiling, George?
I've been fighting for this my whole life. Men need representation, and I'm glad to be able to be the first male representative here on Sorry I'm a Bitch. So I'm honored. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Well, you heard it right. You heard that right. Today we have invited not only any man on this podcast, but a politician. Boo. No, I'm just kidding.
You can boo. That's fine.
George Hornedo is running for Congress here in Indiana, but he's not gunning for just any seat. He's coming for a seat that's been kept warm by the same ass for 17 years. Diego Morales, the Secretary of State in Indiana, allegedly committed voter fraud in 2018. Senator Mike Boacek was charged for operating while intoxicated. Jim Lucas pleaded guilty to driving while intoxicated and leaving the scene of an accident. Are you afraid your clean record will deter people from voting for you?
Yes. No. I mean, no, that's a great question, though, because it points to how wild the state of our politics here in Indiana is. The fact that we have so many Republican officials that are like out of pocket left and right every single day. Diego Morales, the Secretary of State, who you pointed out. I like to say not all skin folk are kinfolk, and Diego is somebody that has constantly had, investigation after him and all this, ethical, shadows around him. You look at Attorney General Todd Rokita, who, same thing. And he leans into being our Ted Cruz. You see all these state legislators on the Republican side of the aisle, and honestly, some on the Democratic side of the aisle, which we have to be honest about and talk about, that are not representing their communities well, that are, not in it for the people, not doing the actual work. And it's more about a jobs program. It's more about status. And that's something that we need to root out on both sides of the aisle.
We have actually brought along a photographer if you wanted to take a mugshot. She's here right now. Did you want to take a mugshot?
I've always been practicing my mean mugging, so this is perfect for it.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I just want you to feel like you fit in when you go to DC. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because you can't be the only one.
I don't like being left out.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we've established you don't drink and drive, you don't commit voter fraud, and you haven't left the scene of an accident. Are you qualified to run?
Exactly. Yes. That's my main qualification. That's why I got into this, because I, passed through those three markers. But no, seriously, this has been my whole kind of, career, public service, trying to find ways to serve, not just Indianapolis, but communities that I care about, the Democratic Party, and get people elected that, believe in, fairness and equity and justice, and, trying to do a lot of good for communities. The way I got into politics and public service is, I joke that I'm a Hoosier by way of Texas. My parents were high school sweethearts in Laredo, Texas, a 96+% Mexican American border town. I was, born in San Antonio. They married young, had me young while in college. Moved back to Laredo, and in those early years, we struggled, young parents, and so I was a WIC baby on government formula, and I don't want to overstate it. I had a wonderful childhood, but like millions of families across the country, kind of struggling paycheck to paycheck just to get by, and so getting older, that was a very tangible example in my own life of the positive impact that government can have on people, if it chooses to, right? And so at the end of the day, right now, at least in our politics, it's two teams, blue or red, and you're not always going to agree with everything. And, big tents are big tents for a reason. Sometimes things can get messy, but, it's about values at the end of the day. And so, I've been very fortunate to, work for a lot of great folks, served in the Obama administration at the Department of Justice under both attorneys general, did civil rights, criminal justice reform, community policing sort of work there. I've worked on a whole bunch of presidential campaigns, including as a senior staffer for Pete Buttigieg in 2020. In the private sector, I've represented cities all over the country, from Birmingham to Jackson to Little Rock to Miami-Dade County, African American Mayors Association more broadly. So have really had the depth and breadth of experience to go deep on the governing side of things and understand kind of how to navigate those barriers and bring resources home, while at the same time understanding the political side of things. And I think desperately what we need right now, not just nationally, but especially thinking about it here in Indy. And I know we'll talk more about kind of the climate here, but somebody that wants to do the job. André Carson is somebody that I know well and I like personally and respect, but sometimes we have to tell the truth, and we didn't tell the truth, with President Biden. Look where that got us, and so it's important that we start doing that. And the unfortunate truth is that Congressman Carson is consistently ranked near the bottom in effectiveness by the Center for Effective Lawmaking, and that's regardless of party, regardless of chamber, the House or the Senate. And we're also lagging behind peer cities, especially in the Midwest, and how much federal funding we're bringing home. So number one is I want to bring more money home to Indianapolis. Number two is party building. And I think because this is the only safe, congressional Democratic seat in our congressional delegation, knock on wood, with redistricting, which I know we'll talk a bit about, but I think that means that whoever sits in the seat needs to not only have a vision for the community and the work ethic to execute upon it, but also take on that additional role or roles of party builder and party leader. And we'll talk a bit more about what that looks like and what that means. But those are two of the really big reasons of why I'm animated for this run.
Speaking of André Carson's been in Congress since 2008. So that's 16 years. In that time, Hoosiers have gone through 2 recessions, a housing crisis, and Mike Pence's RFRA. Why should voters swap out a guy they know because of his grandma for a guy who has a grandma we do not know?
I hope you all get to know my grandma. She's wonderful. And I'll probably bring her out on the scene if I win. And I get my weekly Sunday text from her, checking in. But no.
Yeah, you
but
said, baby, I'm a Nepo baby too. No, I'm
right?
kidding.
It's like, this is actually the Sorry I'm a Nepo Baby podcast
Yeah.
episode, and not Sorry
We
I'm a
actually tried to
politician.
get André Carson for that, and he said no.
Okay, see, it's like you got to
I'm
show
just
up.
kidding.
It's just what I hear from people, lack of presence. But, but I forgot what the question was.
Oh,
Right?
Why
Oh,
you?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is the work that I've done. I know how to bring, kind of money home. My background's been that of a national, Democratic strategist. So I have not only the vision, but the ability to kind of execute on doing the party building side. We just held our first public event yesterday. We call it the People's Power Hour, and it'll be a different substantive topic each month. But on this month, it was around rebuilding the Democratic Party and, kind of redistricting, which is the looming existential fight right now. And back when Democrats in the state were competing and even winning statewide, it's in large part because Indianapolis was organized. We were the best congressional district in the state in voter turnout. All of our precinct chair and vice chair slots, which is the baseline of neighborhood organizing, those slots were filled. People knocking on your door saying, turn out for the Democratic Party. Uh, the county party even had a larger budget than the state Democratic Party. But you fast forward in these past 17 years, unfortunately, Congressman Carson is much more hands off as it comes to the party building side, and we've seen the effects of that. And it's not solely on him; it's on Mayor Hogsett, it's on others, right? But I now look at the fact that the county party is a shadow of what it used to be. It's essentially defunct. 36% of our precinct chair and vice chair slots are unfilled, and most of the ones that are filled are appointed to party insiders that are disconnected from the grassroots. And we are now the worst congressional district in the whole state in voter turnout. And so, we may be in a blue dot, here in Indianapolis with the Democratic mayor, a Democratic member of Congress, a Democratic majority on the city county council, and Democratic state legislators. But if we're not pulling our weight as a community, then we're not just hurting ourselves, but we're a drag on Democrats across the whole state. And so, Indy is the engine that powers Democratic growth statewide. And so, all these other races, statewide races, even this congressional race, this and that, are actually not the most pivotal things to do right now. The most pivotal role changes that we need to make is increasing turnout in Indy, which is why I see my campaign is not just about getting me elected, but being a vehicle to bring more people into the political process, call them in, right? And so happy to go a little bit more in depth on how we're doing that and what that grassroots vehicle looks like. But it's also important that we break the Republican supermajority in the state house. We have been 4 seats short of it, for multiple cycles now, and have not gotten it done. And as a result of not getting it done, it means Republicans don't even have to think about Democrats. They can work on their own. You know, it's been 20 plus years of one party Republican rule. And I just think that one party rule of any party doesn't necessarily lend itself to the best outcomes because then you don't have to work with people. And that's not what this should be about. It's about collaboration, coming together and trying to do what's best for the community at the end of the day.
You've gone to Cornell, Harvard, and George Washington University Law School. You also served in the Obama administration, like you said. Now you're running for a congressional seat in Indiana's 7th district. You're clearly an overachiever, but what made you decide to throw your hat in the ring for this election?
I got tired of looking around and not seeing the leadership that I want to see. And, I had actually started an organization last year called Next Gen Hoosiers because where I believe the ripples of hope here in the state are not necessarily just in younger leaders, but in newer voices. So how do I use my background in politics, my network, to kind of shake trees of donors, not just locally, but across, the country and say, hey, don't forget about us, Democrats in Indiana, we matter too, right? And so, started that in the summer, and then obviously everything happening at the top of the ticket. But we raised a decent amount of money and put that towards supporting state house candidates last cycle. And one of the things that I would always talk about, when talking about, how we build back the party is I said, look, it doesn't matter who the chair of the Indiana Democratic Party is. That is not the vehicle to bring us back because the Democratic brand is so weak right now. So then you look at state house and state senate leadership, and cycle after cycle, they have not materially grown their caucuses or got it done. So then I look at Congressman Frank Mervan in Northwest Indiana, and he doesn't have the luxury to think about party building because he's in a nationally competitive seat. So he's got to look at everything through the lens of how does this help me keep my seat? You know, we've got some bright spots in mayors, Democratic mayors outside of Indy, but none have all three of the interests, the ability, and the experience to take on that party building and party leadership role. And so I think what that means conceptually, regardless of who's in there, is whoever is the mayor of Indy and whoever is the congressperson out of Indy, it's incumbent upon those electeds to not just have a vision for the community and the work ethic to execute upon it, but to also take on that additional, kind of role. And, unfortunately, we have somebody in Mayor Hogsett who not only is, plagued by, scandals and, more interested in building himself than building anything, beyond, that we're not getting it out of the mayor's office right now. And like I said, with Congressman Carson, great guy, nice guy, I like him. But again, we got to tell the truth. He's been coasting on his, his name and his grandmother's legacy for 17 years now, and it's time for change. And so, you know, as I would talk about this, I had folks both locally as well as nationally say, "Why not you?" And then I couldn't really answer why not me in that period of time, and so that started a whole range of conversations. And so I've been building the plan and infrastructure on this for quite some time, and it just made sense to jump in. And we got in April 9th of this year, and we hit the ground running. It's been an incredible journey since.
What's the funniest or most embarrassing experience you've had on the campaign trail so far?
That's a great question. Um, it's not embarrassing, and it is funny, but is more fun than anything. So we work hard and we play hard on the campaign. It's all gas, no brakes, 7 days a week. And my manager, back here, Cleveland, is the absolute best. Uh, it's Cleveland Douglas the third, and he's very particular about that third. So everywhere we go, it's letting it be known it's Cleveland Douglas the third, right? So love that. But
An actual Nepo baby.
right. But Cleveland is a karaoke aficionado. And I don't think I quite realized it when I was, interviewing him to be the campaign manager. And I said, look, I'm just going to be transparent. Like, I'm not going to, this is not a normal campaign. Like, from the jump, 16 months out, 15 months out, whatever, from the primary, we're going to be every single day, right? We're going to be long hours. how do you take care of yourself, right? How do you like, de-stress? And he was like, oh, well, I really like karaoke and, so have a good time. And I said, okay, cool. That's, endearing, Then he gets here and I get to learn, oh no, you're about that life, right? So karaoke, 3 or 4 times immediately, started like knowing the scene, all the different spots that had it, known by the DJs, known by the bartenders, etc. And I go and finally watch him. And the first few weeks, the man's got a voice of an angel. First thing I saw him sing was Brian McKnight Back at One. Then it was, Tennessee Whiskey, and then Drops of Jupiter by Train. And then we find out that there's a U.S. Karaoke Association, and they had qualifiers here in Indy. And so we're like, let's check it out. And so he pays, entry fee, goes in, he wins, so then it goes on to the state level. And we do that, and like the competition was like even more elevated, and it was very strong for that qualifiers. He wins that. So now in November, we're going to Las Vegas for nationals, and he has to have 6 songs ready. So like we're out here, practicing that. So in the way that he manages me for the campaign, I feel like it's like a Rocky Balboa scene, and like training him and managing him for the karaoke competition. So that has been a through line so far of how we kind of de-stress a little bit, have a little bit of fun, and just a little bit of a different texture than I think what you usually see. So that's been fun.
Well, I also love that because he's ride or die. He wears your shirt up on stage. Like, I love that. You do have a very, very beautiful voice. He like posts about it on his
Hey, it's like I feel I'm always up there like with a camera, and I feel like I'm a proud mom and everything. It's crazy, but no, it's a good time.
Well, I was a part of the Hillary Clinton campaign, back in '08. And when I was working the phone bank, I had a woman call me a
I've been called that too.
yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, sisters.
Mm-hmm.
If you do happen to like come across her, will you tell her that like I'm still a I know that was her name. No way. No shit. Also, my grandma, fun fact, she was on the phone with who she thought was my brother, and she was just going off like, man, I've had so many beans. Like it's crazy. Like my stomach is tore up. I can't leave the bathroom. And then at the end of the conversation, the person was like, "Ma'am, I'm canvassing. Like I'm calling you about George Hornedo." So I don't know if you heard that story. No, that was my grandma. Let me push this cat the fuck out. He thinks he's a star. You're running in a time of recession fears, culture wars, and massive distrust in the government. So just give us a quick little elevator pitch for everyone listening in the Indianapolis area about like how you're going to kind of tamper those fears and the mistrust that we have currently in the government.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that you touched on that's really important, but to me, the foundational thing is not issue specific, like an affordability, right, which is incredibly important, but it is that piece about lack of trust in institutions, because the further we go down on that line, the worse that it is, right? And so it's been interesting in the campaign. I've had a coalition of everybody from Democratic Socialists to Republicans and everybody in between coming into the fold. And, some are more animated by certain aspects of the campaign than others and what brings them in. But what I've found that everybody universally gets behind is the idea that we're all far more complex than what any one label may denote, right? I think some people, as an example, when they always ask me, "Are you progressive or moderate?" and I said, I kind of reject that binary, right? I think to the extent it was informative before, it doesn't make sense for the moment in time that we're in now. I don't think it's progressive versus moderate. I don't think it's young versus old. We're hearing a lot about fighters versus folders, which I think is true to a degree, but I think it's even deeper than that. I think the divide in the Democratic Party right now is between those that think our systems and institutions largely work, and we simply need to protect them and manage this period of decline, versus those like myself that say, well, yeah, that goes without saying. We have to protect what we have as best as we can, but we also don't have a lot of power right now as Democrats, not just in the state, but nationally. And so, you know, whenever we come back into power, government's going to look totally different. We're only 8 months into this and already looks, it's a 180, right? And so the chaos of the Trump administration right now will bring about an opportunity to rebuild. And so the question I think then becomes, do we rebuild back to what we had, which clearly wasn't, sufficiently meeting and serving the needs of people, or do we have the imagination to think about what can be and building what comes next? And for me, if we're going to have a binary of left versus right, I'd rather that binary be up or down. You know, I don't care if something is up to the left, up to the center, up to the right. Are we solving people's problems? To me, it should always be about accountability and results. And that's a message that has kind of unified a lot of people. And so I call it the big middle. And I don't mean middle from a ideological standpoint, but the big middle of people that don't feel seen and heard in our politics. And I think that's why you see, across the country, but especially here in Indiana and especially here in Indianapolis, such a turnout problem and a lack of engagement. Because I can't tell you the number of times we've been knocking doors every single day for the past few months, phone banking every single day. And the number of times I have somebody say, I'm the first candidate to ever come to their door, the first candidate to ask, what do they care about? What do they want to see better, right?
You're the first candidate that we've had,
Yeah,
or
right.
someone knock on our door.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. It is, you have to. You see a lot of people talk about the idea of like meeting people where they are, and I kind of hate that phrase because to me there's something kind of patronizing about it. It's like coming down from one's perch, and it shouldn't be meeting people where they are. It should be walking alongside them in community already. Because you can't really represent community that you don't fully grasp your arms around. And so I think that's the other way of rethinking this role, not just being the representative in DC, not just being the party builder and party leader like I talked about, but being that community connector, that convener, that collaborator. Because like I mentioned, I've done work with cities all over the country, and one of the things that we're certainly lacking here, at least to the level that I've seen in other places, is that connectivity. And we have all the assets. We've got people doing interesting, impactful work, across all areas of civic and public life, but there's not always, the talking to each other. There's not always that coming together. And I think that's a role that, elected leaders can and should play, but we haven't seen that in the ways that could be done.
Governor Mike Braun has floated a special session in November to possibly redraw the congressional boundaries. How does that directly affect your campaign?
I'm going to go off on a while on this because I think it's important to really kind of lay out what this means, right? Because I don't want to assume everybody knows what redistricting means or anything like that. So let's take it back, 1,000-foot view. President Trump's popularity is quickly declining. That's very clear. You can look at any poll, the numbers or show that. He fears losing the House because if he loses the House, then Democrats will have investigative power and authorities for all the corruption that we see happening in this administration. And so what does he do? He needs to cheat to hold on to power. So it started with Texas, and he got the Republican governor and the legislature there to redraw their congressional maps to get a number more of Republican seats. What he didn't anticipate is that Texas State House Democrats would break quorum, flee to Illinois, show the nation, inspire folks what it looks like to fight. What he didn't anticipate is that Governor Newsom and California Democrats would respond in kind. So now where we find ourselves is a race to the bottom where both, Democratic states and Republican states are looking at potentially redrawing their maps. And don't get me wrong, we absolutely need to fight fire with fire because I think for too long Democrats have taken spoons to a knife fight, whereas Republicans bring a machete or a machine gun, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to be doing this, but it is bad for democracy. It is a race to the bottom. And so this started with J.D. Vance coming to Indy a couple months ago, pushing this. Then, a month later, Republican legislators, here in Indiana went to the White House and got additional pressure. I think conventional wisdom at first was that maybe Republicans would draw an 8-1 map. Right now it's 7-2. 7 Republican seats, 2 Democratic seats. The seat that I'm running for here in Indianapolis is the only safe Democratic seat in the delegation. The other Democratic seat is in Northwest Indiana, held by Frank Mervan, but that's a competitive seat already as it is. And so they are looking at squeezing 1, if not 2 more seats in a safe Republican map. So in a state where 40+% of folks are voting Democrat, we would have no representation in Congress. So that's blatant cheating, right? So when we hear people talk about mid-decade redistricting, when we hear the idea of fair maps, that misses the point because it's accepting the premise and it's normalizing something that isn't normal. And so this is what we're trying to fight back against. Governor Braun, like you mentioned, had been pretty quiet on this for a while, because the reality is that Governor Braun, the state Senate president, the Speaker of the Indiana, House, they don't inherently want to do this, but they're getting bullied, right? And so Governor Braun said the most last week or a couple weeks ago, when he said, if Indiana doesn't get this done, there are likely repercussions financially in working with the Trump administration. So he said the quiet part out loud. He went on to say that he thinks that Indiana will get there. He may call a special session as early as November, or it may be the first agenda item on regular session in early January. As of right now, they don't have the votes in the state house. They don't have the votes in the state senate. But what that also means is that we have time. We may not have a lot of power as Democrats right now in the state, but we have time to make our voice heard. And so that's why I've kind of pivoted my campaign in this existential moment, not just for myself, but for Democrats at large, to be a vehicle for grassroots defense. Because all these rallies that are happening, that's great, don't get me wrong, but it's the same 1, 2, 300 people that are already very active and are already very plugged in and even know that a rally exists. And also rallies are one-off actions that unless you turn that into sustained, grassroots defense, then you're losing out, right? And so every ounce of volunteer energy, every hour of knocking doors, every phone banking shift that we have in the campaign is not just going to identifying supporters for myself, but to educating neighbors on what's at stake with redistricting, right? And enabling them to take action. So we actually have on my website, georgehornedo.com, right there on the homepage, a button that says Protect Indy's Voice. And anybody that clicks on it will be, sent to a pre-populated email that one can edit as they see fit and push off a message to Governor Braun and Republican officials saying no new maps. The sort of political environment that we're in right now, Senator Banks held a MAGA convening a few weeks ago in Noblesville, and he said, speaking of Democrats, they killed Charlie Kirk. So the least we can do is draw a safe 9-0 Republican map. At that same convening, a Trump advisor, said, this is no longer a political battle, this is a spiritual battle. And we're up against a wicked ideology. Again, referring to Democrats. So we have to erase their power. This is not politics as normal. This is, not, exaggeration to say we were fighting authoritarianism at this point. You see, demonizing of political opponents. James Comey was just indicted, right? You see, naming Antifa, which doesn't even exist, as a terrorist organization, and then having this broad, kind of definition of what, is included in that, to be able to make it to where even protesters, peaceful protesters, are domestic terrorists, right? Like, this is the direction that we're going. And so this is a time that, I understand that people are disillusioned. I can't blame anybody for being disillusioned, but it's not the time to step away. It's the time to step up.
Okay, well, on that note, let's have a little fun.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to play This or That Indiana edition. Indy 500 or a Colts game.
Colts game.
Cornfields or the downtown skyline.
Downtown skyline.
Breaded tenderloin sandwich, sugar cream pie.
Breaded tenderloin sandwich.
Pacers in the playoffs or IU Purdue in March Madness.
Pacers in the playoffs.
Mass Ave brunch or Broad Ripple dive bar.
Broad Ripple dive bar.
Lake Michigan beach day or Brown County hike.
Lake Michigan beach day.
Lucas Oil Stadium roof open or closed.
Open, always.
A night at the state fair or a night at the symphony.
State fair. I'm all about the games at the state fair. I become like a 12-year-old, and I'll just spend all my money being like, give me another baseball. Let me see, how fast if I can throw it, like, the football, everything, right? Yeah.
Campaigning door to door or a campaign fundraiser dinner.
I mean, door to door is what I prefer. It's the most fun because that's how you actually get to do the thing. But those fundraisers get the resources so we can do the door to door, right? So
So you're a capitalist. Driving I-65 traffic or taking Indigo.
Indigo.
Gugman or Metazoa.
Metazoa.
I probably would have picked all of the same that you chose. Who is someone you look up to in politics?
I mean, there are a number of people. I came up under, President Obama is the first person that I voted for. Mm-hmm. I had volunteered during senior year of high school here in Indy when he was running, and obviously he turned Indiana blue. I joke that I was a perennial Obama world intern during, undergrad and grad school, from interning at the White House to the presidential campaign reelect, headquarters in Chicago, presidential inaugural committee, Department of Education, whole host of other things. Got my first, full-time job after my master's degree as a presidential appointee, in the administration at the Department of Justice. Ended up working at the Obama Foundation later on. So that was kind of, how I came up. So
Oh.
yeah, definitely President Obama.
And someone you look up to outside of politics.
I mean, again, a number of folks there. I mean, politics, right? So, I mean, my parents, right? I mean, none of this are things that I could have done without the love and support of my parents, right? They sacrificed so much for me to have kind of the opportunities that I've been able to have, and that informs kind of how the lens of which I look at the world, right? To me, the single most, you know, impactful, important, and shameful policy failure in this country is poverty. And, like I said, informed a little bit by, my own background and being able to benefit from such programs. But the fact that 1 in 4 kids in India lives in poverty is as shocking as it is unacceptable. And that's based off metrics, developed 60 plus years ago that haven't been updated since, right? And so, I always look at things through the lens of how does this affect the underserved child, right? And so, my parents had, a lot of foresight. I had the instruction of great teachers. I had the knowledge that if I work towards something that I can achieve it, and having a support system behind me. And, I've been able to achieve my own American dream, but I can't overlook the fact that it's increasingly out of reach for more and more people, right? And so, my parents instilled in me values of public service, right? The importance of education, the idea of lifting, while you climb. And so that's always been something that's important to me. And let's climb is kind of a tagline that I use in the campaign, because again, I think about it from a few different perspectives. One, the lifting while climbing. Two, if I don't really believe in that left-right binary and I'm more up or down, just how are we getting to help people, constantly climbing. Three, thinking about this political moment when things can feel so dire, because they are, we have to hold out a level of hope, and we have to know that it's not going to be easy, but we have to keep climbing. We have to keep, pushing forward. And so my parents, from that perspective, I think, Joyce Muchin is a mentor of mine from Cornell. She was, led a bunch of the student groups within the Cornell Public Service Center, of which I was, extremely involved. And, she was somebody early on in kind of my journey into service that taught me what it really means, right? It shouldn't be drive by, service. You want to kind of peel the layer deeper and see, okay, if you're helping out a food kitchen, let's talk about food insecurity. Why are things this way, right? And trying to have that deeper understanding. So that's really helped me kind of in my career, and especially now as a candidate, be better and stronger, because it's wanting that deeper level of connection, and not just kind of surface level. And then, Tony Coelho is actually my campaign chair, and, he's a party elder. And, Tony was elected to Congress at 36 out of California, and he's kind of the godfather and dean of, elected staffers turned elected officials, right? So his mentees are actually folks like, you know, Josh Shapiro and, Terry McAuliffe, and others that are of the same ilk. And Tony's been kind of my Yoda in this process, and guru in helping me kind of navigate a lot of the battles in this, and it has been a strong force, to kind of shape me along the way. So those are some of the mentors in different aspects of my life that I think about.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. You know what? I might invite another man on. This wasn't so bad.